Have you seen any places that are doing this well? You mentioned there are some that, you can determine, are they getting worse? Are they getting better? For those that are doing well, and I'll start there because we know that a lot of are not. But for those that are doing well, what are some of the distinguishing characteristics that will help a police precinct to actually be effective at being smart on crime and, sort of dispensing with the bravado, tough on crime, my budget's bigger than yours. Like, I mean, but without that, where are we seeing actual measurable improvements in the way that policing is done in this country?
So one of the key shifts in terms of outcomes that we've seen really concentrated in larger cities over the past several years has been a reduction in arrests for low-level offenses. So this is a huge issue. Nationwide, only about 5% of all arrests are for violent crime. Only about 12% of all arrests are for property.
Is that right? Only 5% for violent crime?
Yeah.
Well, that can't be right, because my mayor and people all over the news are telling me how terrible crime is. It's rising everywhere. Now I got to buy my toothpaste behind plexiglass. I mean, that's what I keep hearing. You're telling me only 5% of
5% for violent crime, and 1% of arrests are for homicides. So you hear about this big spike in homicides, and obviously that's concerning. But we're talking about 1% of all arrests. So when police are saying they need more resources, more budget in order to, aggressively take on this issue of increasing homicide rates, that's 1% of what police are doing with their resources. What they're really doing with their resources, the vast majority of arrests nationwide are for low-level nonviolent offenses. And so what we have seen, particularly in some of the largest cities in the country, have been a reduction in arrests for low-level offenses. And a lot of that is because of organizers, activists, holding mayors accountable, holding city council members accountable, and pushing for decriminalization of marijuana, for example, moving away from the policing and arrests for things like sex work and homelessness, crimes of poverty. So we're seeing a huge drop in arrests for vagrancy or loitering or trespassing, liquor violations, drug possession, crimes that tend to be associated with poverty and substance use. And people who need help. And so those shifts are associated with substantial reductions in police shootings as well. So in cities that have seen the largest reduction in low-level arrests, they've also seen the largest reduction in police shootings. So for the cities that have cut low-level arrests by 50% or more between 2013 and 19, police shootings went down by an average of 57%. And that's fatal and non-fatal police shootings.
Wow.
So that
is huge.
That's huge. And so that's a big part of the solution, is reducing the overall size and scope of policing overall, and in particular, the amount of police contact over some of these low-level issues. And that makes sense when we look at the data on police killings as well. So the majority of killings by police last year, there were 1,134 people killed by the police. The majority of those cases were in response to an incident that started off as either a mental health check, another type of low-level nonviolent offense, a traffic stop, or a simple disturbance. So a whole host of issues that are some of these low-level issues that now are resulting in people, the majority of these cases in which people are end up being killed by the police. So that's a big part of the solution, is reducing arrests and incarceration for some of these low-level issues, creating alternative responses to them. So we see mental health first responder programs starting up in some cities, creating alternatives to traffic enforcement, creating alternatives to what now is the aggressive policing of homelessness, actually getting folks support and help rather than arresting and incarcerating them. So that's a big part of the solution.
It feels to me like when you say things like 5% of arrests are for violent crime, 1% are for homicide, it's hard for me to square that circle with the notion that right now in New York City, for example, we have a $6 billion budget for the NYPD. Just New York City, not New York State, just New York City, $6 billion budget. There has been a request from governing authorities that number be increased. Now, if you're telling me only 1% of the average police budget is going to homicides, only 5% are going to violent crimes, and of the 11,000 see, that's how rumors get started, bad numbers. Of the 1,133 people who were fatally killed by police last year, more than half of those incidences began as nonviolent. There was no homicide. We're talking mental health checks and disturbances of that sort. How is it that we are justifying the rampant increase in policing budgets that we're seeing, at the same time, we're decreasing the amount of money in all of these other places that could be showing up at just the solutions you mentioned. If we were beefing those up, if they were not even more than the police, on parity, right? On par with what the police departments were getting, it feels like that would be a better return on investment. Can you talk to us about is there a justification for continuing to maintain this level of funding for police, considering the data that you just shared with us?
There's not a justification. So, I mean, that's why they're relying heavily on fear mongering, on not being clear about the numbers and statistics. So this is why it's news to so many people, is because they want you to believe that they're spending all of these resources to solve homicides and keep people safe. But in the reality, that's not what they're spending that money doing. And policing is most often the largest expenditure in a city's budget. So, and then when it does come to homicides, in many cities, the majority of homicides, they're not even solving. So even when it comes to the resources that they already have, they're spending those resources arresting people for low-level offenses and not even focusing on the issue that they're saying is the big issue right now. So there's not a justification. What is hopeful, though, about this, about the situation we're in today, is that we are seeing some cities begin to pilot alternatives. Mental health first responder programs have been among the most widespread in big cities. They're starting to pilot those. They're piloting that in Harlem right now. They're piloting a similar program in San Francisco. They're piloting a program in Minneapolis and a number of other cities across the country. And the initial data is starting to come in from those programs. And what we're finding, you look at a program like in Denver, the STAR program. So they're responding to a host of mental health calls. Many of those involve folks who are homeless. And they responded to over 700 of those calls in the 6-month pilot of the program. They sent 748 responses to mental health calls. So this program is sending mental health professionals instead of the police to mental health calls. They're diverting those calls from the police. And what they found in those 748 calls that were responded to, nobody was arrested, nobody was incarcerated. And wow. So they successfully responded to each and every one of those calls without needing to call the police for backup. They got people help, the services and supports that they needed. And they proved that you don't need the police to respond to these types of incidents. So that's a huge start in Denver. And that's not the only city that's doing this. And what's also interesting about this is when you look at the budget for these programs, they're cheaper. They cost less per call responded to than the police. So they save the city money, they save taxpayers money, they result in fewer people being harmed or arrested or incarcerated by the police. It's a win-win. But the sad part is that not enough cities are currently deploying this type of a model. And the cities that are, it's still a small proportion of the overall call volume that they're receiving. So you look at New York City, they have the Be Heard program where they're sending folks to mental health calls in Harlem, but it's less than 1% of the mental health calls citywide that are being responded to. So there's still a lot of room to scale those programs up and fund those programs adequately to meet that demand. And so I think that's the work that needs to happen, is building out these alternatives, of course, collecting and reporting data on them so they can be evaluated. But so far, the data that's coming in looks good.
So this is exciting to me because there was a similar program, slightly different, but a similar, an alternative to policing program. It was a pilot program in Brownsville. This was run during the pandemic. So I know folks are like, well, you got all this data from before. What about during the Rona when the crime is really spiking? This was during the pandemic, like just last year. And they found that when the police pulled back, and when violence interrupters, community support organizations were allowed to assume those positions, that they did not have a spike in violence. And in fact, they were able to ensure that the community that they were servicing were getting access, as you noted in Denver, to the services that they needed. They were being connected to the actual agencies that could help them resolve the issues that they were experiencing. Typically, they would have gone to the police for those resolutions, and often they would not have the issue resolved, but they would now be a part of the infrastructure of the system. But we don't see those types of programs getting the funding. We don't see those types of programs even getting the promotion that they should be getting. And we seem to be in an era right now, these are my words, not yours, where there is a real a lead up to the 94 Crime Bill 2.0. It's as if we learned absolutely nothing. It's as if we've had none of this data. And I'm wondering if you have seen pathways that organizers have taken that are more successful than others at being able to get people to actually listen. After the event we had in Brownsville, that pilot program, you would have thought people would have been calling the local assembly member Walker. You would have thought people would have called her up to find out, well, how did you do this? You would have thought people would have been excited about how to replicate it. But what we see instead is a return to the old refrain. We need more money for the police. Defunding the police is just something those leftist progressives really want. It doesn't really work. What you're telling us is that it does. And not even so much worrying about funding or defunding the police, but adequately funding these alternative programs. That is working. Who are the organizers that are making this case effectively, and what skills are they using that all of us should be trying to incorporate?
Great question. So in terms of how to make the case for these types of changes, I think that data can be a powerful tool for doing that, and particularly cutting through some of the noise and the misinformation that we're hearing from the police. So the police would have you believe that they've been defunded already, that they don't have enough resources or enough officers to respond to these issues. But I mean, get that data, right? You could go to policescorecard.org and find a lot of this data. In many cases, the police themselves are publishing this data on their website around the total number of arrests and what those arrests are for. The federal government does have data on arrests. They don't have data on people killed by the police. They do have data on arrests though. And almost every law enforcement agency reports data on arrests every single year without issue. And so you can go to the Crime Data Explorer, the federal government's Crime Data Explorer website, and look at your city, find your police department and see how many arrests are they making, how many did they make last year or the year before, and what were those arrests for? Because what you'll find is that very few of them are for violent crimes, and even fewer are for homicides. And most of what those arrests are for, the single largest category of arrests nationwide is for drugs. And most of those drug arrests are drug possession arrests alone. So in fact, every single year, the police make more arrests for drug possession than they make for every single violent crime combined. So that data is publicly available. The police
You said drug possession, not drug dealing. You just said, I got caught with my pipe. I got caught with my this, that, or the other, my paraphernalia, and boom, there's our policing dollars.
Yep.